Ana il shummi Yohanna odishu biru.
The Semele massacre began on August 7, 1933. Thousands of Assyrians were slaughtered as Arab and Kurdish forces raided the district of Semele in northern Iraq. The Assyrians had previously been disarmed and were defenseless against the attacks. Men were rounded up and shot dead. Women and young girls were raped and made to march naked before the Iraqi commanders. Children were run over by military cars, pregnant women stabbed with bayonets. The massacres were indiscriminate. They killed men and women, young and old.
سميلي ناشي رقلي ولا برمته وقتلته وسميلي ورقلي ناشي بليل بيوم أرقي ورابة مني قتلي ولا برمي ولا أنا إيون وسورة تنياوى يمي قالي يمرا وآتي سورتوا إثوالو اشتيرخ أنا إثوالي اشتيرخ القفلتي منوا.
Yuhanna's mother left everything behind and fled alongside her neighbors, carrying him in her arms. But he would not stop crying, and this posed a risk for others, who insisted she leave him behind.
قلت إن أني شمي ولا قال تأتي يفدقي ولا قم برمي ولا كلها ليش وقي وأبخى يعني أبهمت من ليزا بريوهم زميوها ولا خب صارخ ولا خيان أنت قربة أغذال بلكي نيخة هم زميوها قد برمي والأغذال تلشمي والقالة قرداي قد أذي دوقي ولا برمي ولا رابا بجنجر رولاي.
Finally, she was given an ultimatum. She was either to leave her son behind or part ways with the group. Bravely, she chose to go alone.
أني كل بيزالي ومغدالي أني مرة خنا رابي البرونخ ومخلص ريشخ يمرأ أنا بروني ليرا بينا ين أنا وبروني مخلطنا ين ميدخ مغدال لا قم رابيالي قم خلطانا خلص لآي وخلص لي أنا إيجا إيدان تنتخار ليمي زعمتي لا يمي يقري تخرنا هي باخر قال دي إياها متسب يمي خبختها رابس بايابا ما يرنتاوا يمغباوا ناشي لاوا من بختاذا تمزما والناشي ينهنا رابا زودا من لازم سبما يمي قمتا ويا تمتا بابا ويما ميثي واي سورتاوا قمتا وقبيت بو خالاذا آي ما يوداوا أن سوراي ديان ماثا يأسقيوا لهن الطورة مندي قطيوا طربة وهن وذي وقأر وقت ميتيوا آي جماعة ليال سورة ماثا كلها كسلدية متى ولا قد خانش شنورة بشلا ولا ودريا ولا يمي خلتا قد أخليوا كلها مثما وبالا هل قد ديريوا ناشاي بابا ويما ديريوا من طورة كما يدوال لبة وكما يدوال حنية البرونة دي لقم ربيعال.
Yuhanna and his mother managed to rebuild their lives in Syria, where they were reunited with his father in the Assyrian town of Tel Arbush, along the Khabur River. He went on to become one of the executives of an oil company, where he worked for most of his adult life. He married and had 7 children of his own, 3 sons and 4 daughters. His own family is now scattered across the globe as a result of continued oppression and persecution against Assyrians. Today, he resides in the town of Skokie, Illinois.
خلوق طارد بيتك ورخصي أي لويته منن.
Though he's been away from home for 17 years, he remains hopeful that one day he will see it again.
النويلة أطراي قدشت ننوي وهي والقا أطراي إن أنا هاون صاخ دير التامة قرأ كل أطراي دير التامة الأثري أطري إيه كيلة وإراق أخني أثرا إيوه وإراق ليه أثرت عرباي ينتقر ذاي إيوه وأطراي كودو كتخبرت انفجت أثرات أن إليت أطراي وإراق وسوريا وكل خدوك ما روخ وطابخ من آلها قد بلتها وخفرقانة هيك وانقبار كلها جلة رجالة كلها رائعة رائعة وأخني ليوخ وترايديا ليلة يتخار لي أنيو ماذا تيري بابا ويما وأهواذا وجنجر وإريق ومقمل لي وممطي لي هل لي دار جدية ليلة يتخمون بداي ولت لي تو تخمن هذا
The narrator of this video is the granddaughter of that gentleman, and that's why it makes it even more important. Our keynote speaker tonight has traveled from Canada to be here with us today. I will briefly read a part of her impressive biography. Riva Givergis is a PhD candidate in the Political Science Department at McMaster University. She specializes in international relations, drawing on post-colonial and decoloniality theories with a focus on indigenous politics. Her doctorate research focuses on examining indigeneity in the Middle East, especially examining the case of the Assyrian people of Iraq. Please help me welcome our keynote speaker, Riva Givergis.
Watching that video before I begin even my speech, as Carmen mentioned, his granddaughter's narrating, who I recently met and became friends with, and listening to that story just makes me think of what could be and what have we lost. You know, I think if his mother didn't take him, then his granddaughter would not be here, and that itself would have been a loss. So with that, I'm honored to be here, and before I begin, I want to recognize the direct survivors and their descendants who continue to triumph and push forward despite all the obstacles they face. Mr. Yohanna's words that Assyrians nowadays have forgotten the days their ancestors suffered and fled to get them where they are today are crucial for understanding our current plight as Assyrians. For those who are living in the diaspora and those who are living in modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. The act of forgetting these atrocities is no accident, but rather it reflects the intergenerational trauma that Assyrians endure as we attempt to find ways of coping and surviving. For Assyrians, these acts of atrocities begin with Seifo and proceed to this day with the continuous genocide, persecution, dispossession of lands, and assimilation policies targeted against them. One way of coping with these atrocities is to forget and move forward. However, as I argue in this talk, as Assyrians, we do not have the privilege of forgetting because these acts of genocide continue. The survival of our people is at stake. Instead, we must educate ourselves, our youth, and the international community of past atrocities committed during Seifo in 1915 in Turkey, Simel in 1933, and Fel in 1988 in northern Iraq, and the ongoing acts of violence after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the rise of ISIL in 2014 that systematically aim at the erasure of Assyrians on their indigenous territory. Importantly, we need to recognize that the borders between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran are modern colonial constructions. Assyrians traditionally inhabited these lands even after the fall of their empire. So while, Assyrians in Turkey in 1915 were suffering and they fled to Iraq, they were not refugees in Iraq. They were traveling between their traditional territory. That's important to recognize because these states divide us up, but we belong in that region. So while we know that the Assyrian genocide of 1915 took place during the same time as the more well-known Armenian genocide, which resulted in the killing of 250,000 Assyrians between 1914 and 1918, decreasing our population there to half its size, and the massacre of Semele in August 1933 by Arabs and Kurds, which was the first act that the Iraqi state took part of in order to signify who its citizens were and who they were not. Together, what these do is that they show how these nations build up their nation. What these nations do, it's not an accident that they kill all these Assyrians. What they're doing is they were trying to build their nation. So in order to do that, they tried to establish it as an Arab state by saying that the Iraqis were, foreigners coming from Turkey, or that they worked with the West, or that their religion was different. They used all these different excuses because they were suspicious of Assyrians because they refused to fall under Arab nationalism, which was seen as a solution to British foreign intervention. However, the growing definition of Iraq along Arab cultural and ethnic lines is exasperating their feelings of not belonging. For one, the targeting of Assyrian illuminates the extent of the Iraqi state's power in constructing a homogeneous nation by ensuring that communities such as Assyrians do not pose a threat to the nation. So the Assyrians, because that is our land, and we live on that traditional territory, do pose a threat to the Iraqi nation. The formation of Iraq demonstrates the violence that is associated with building a nation based on one dominant collective identity. The tension between the state and its inability to accommodate Assyrians would continue throughout different periods under different regimes in Iraq's history. The erasure of Mesopotamia's indigenous inhabitants cannot be studied in isolation. Rather, it must be studied in conjunction with the modern phenomena of nationalism and nation building that has required, even necessitated, the removal of those identified as outsiders or foreign. This is how nation building and nationalism work. The modern states of Turkey and Iraq were created to be homogeneous nation states, meaning those who do not identify as Turks or Arabs, respectively, could not be part of the nation. An indigenous scholar, Patrick Wolf, examines this relationship between genocide and the settler colonial state. He calls it the logic of elimination. What he says is that contest for life, so the fight for life and land are the same. So anytime that we are fighting for our land, we're fighting for our life in Iraq and the region. So the main motive for eliminating Assyrians is not race or religion or ethnicity, but access to territory. Territoriality is settler colonial specific irreducible element. So what we're seeing here is that this logic of erasing becomes utilized by these different states in order to wipe out Assyrians because our land is crucial. We also see this work taking place in the Iraqi state with the political elites when they attempted to create a homogeneous Arab state, and in Turkey when they created a Turkish state. In both these instances, violence against the other, in this case Assyrians, was justified because this particular community was marked as the other. Following the massacre, integration into Iraq became a primary concern of most Assyrians, with many managing to integrate to the newly cultural Arab-dominated Iraq, with the exception of those in the north, like specifically Dohuk and Zahol. So it's no coincidence that many Assyrians are divided. It's no coincidence that many of us speak Arabic or English or all these things, because what ends up happening is we become integrated into these societies because it's a way of coping and surviving. So violence against Assyrians doesn't end with Seifo or Semele. Rather, you encounter a story of sadness and loss with almost every Assyrian person you meet, whether still residing on their traditional land or in the diaspora. These stories shape our identity as we aim to navigate our place in a world that has failed to recognize the atrocities committed against us by various powers and states. The 2003 US-led invasion in Iraq has exacerbated this violence because while all Iraqis are suffering, there are specifics to the case of the Assyrian people that puts them at higher risk and possibly extinction. There was a large exodus of Christians as community members were targeted for their religious differences as well as their perceived ties to the West, depleting the population to 350 Christians in 2014 from a number that was 800 to 1.4 million prior to 2003. More specifically, With the rise of ISIL, you saw Assyrians being affected and facing persecution and violence. And now they're even at a greater risk of extinction since their population is significantly smaller. In particular, a report by the United Nations Mission for Iraq and the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported that in the period just between September 11 to December 2014, members of Iraq's diverse ethnic and religious community that include Turkmen, Shebeks, Christian, Yazidi, and Sabaeans, and others have been intentionally and systematically targeted by ISIL and other armed groups and subjected to gross human rights abuses. These appear to be a deliberate policy aimed at destroying, suppressing, or expelling these communities permanently from these areas under their control. The ramifications of these atrocities are profound. Firstly, beginning with Safo, we are witnessing the complete disregard of states in the Middle East and internationally to safeguard vulnerable minorities in this region who are culturally, ethnically, linguistically, and religiously distinct from the dominant Arab and Kurdish groups. In doing this, these states achieve their nationalistic goals by eliminating the other who does not identify with the dominant group. Unfortunately, this also means that this strips the region of its diversity and multiculturalism. These states have thus far been successful in covering up their genocides, to the point where many Assyrians are unaware of these massacres. Secondly, the ongoing crisis ensuing from ISIL has resulted in large numbers of internally displaced people, Assyrians migrating from Iraq, and the ongoing process of resettlement since the overwhelming majority of Assyrian refugees from the Nineveh Plain plan to return home. They still want to go home, as Mr. Yohanna said, and as I'm sure many of us here, even though we've assimilated in the diaspora, would love to go home, at least, if not permanently, to be able to visit as often as I wish, and as I'm sure you wish. However, Assyrians wanting this find themselves in dire situation, as many are not able to return, since their towns have been reduced to ruins with no running water or electricity. Restoration and rebuilding are lacking, as this process can only begin with their return, and when they do return, they face discrimination or have their homes be occupied. Simply put, while the lives of Assyrians since 2003 have not been secure, 4 years after ISIL, they are undergoing yet another period of transition that has completely uprooted their lives. Thirdly, these atrocities and acts of genocide have resulted in the extensive displacement of Assyrians from their ancestral homeland. The indigenous Assyrian community differs from other indigenous communities in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, because while these communities have suffered colonial genocide, many of them still continue to reside on the traditional territory that they are from. Whereas Assyrians, for centuries, have been forcibly displaced, leading to many of them being in the diaspora, where they are required to assimilate or risk being targeted for their differences. The concept of return is more predominant among Iraqis who belong to the mainstream population, in contrast to Assyrians, with many having severed their contacts with Iraq and focused on their obligations and responsibilities to their host country, even though they maintain their heritage and identity. The sad reality of this is, regardless of how Assyrian your household or other community organizations strive to be, we are facing a difficult task. We are consistently encountering the assimilative nature of our host countries. This is not to undermine the ambitions of Assyrians in the diaspora or that these host countries have not been welcoming enough, but rather it reflects the reality that regardless of the majority of the members of these groups maintaining their ethnic identities and being involved actively or passively in domestic, regional, and international politics, we are a stateless nation. While Assyrians in the diaspora work hard to preserve their ethnic identity, we need to challenge and question the systematic and structural reason causing this forcible displacement. It is no accident that I am an immigrant settler in Canada, raised and currently residing on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. This forced displacement of myself and countless other Assyrian immigrants and refugees has required relinquishing certain aspects of identity because although I know I am from Mesopotamia, I am not able to live there. Indigenous writers Patricia Montour and Patricia McGuire tell us, the land is who we are as people. To know who you are, you must also know where you come from. This means understanding the relationship you have with the territory of your people. Accordingly, the dispossession of indigenous peoples from their ancestral land has a profound impact on their identity, especially in this world where states really matter. Here I am thinking of my own family, where although we have ties to being Assyrian, my nieces and nephews do not fully understand what this means, since their connection to their ancestral land has been severed. The connection that arises is whether Assyrians can simply learn to move on, or will these atrocities continue to reverberate through future generations? Simply put, we can't move on. Intergenerational trauma persists since these atrocities have not been recognized, and our trauma, along with the older generations, has gone untreated. Similar to other indigenous groups, trauma-related stress experienced by survivors is passed on to second and subsequent generations, with each generation continuing to experience trauma. While Assyrians are extremely resilient, it is important to acknowledge this trauma, because one of the ways for us to move forward is to have the Seifo and Semele genocide recognized in order to move toward reconciliation and healing. It is crucial to recognize these atrocities along with the events since 2003 that include the murder, kidnapping, displacement, land confiscation, and displacement of Assyrians as systematic that seek to uproot Assyrians from their lands. This is no easy task, but it begins by educating ourselves on the injustice committed against our people. We do this by building alliances with people who have suffered similar violence and learning from their lessons. Specifically here, I am thinking of other groups that are indigenous in Canada or the United States or Australia and New Zealand. Internationally, it requires us being involved with ensuring the implementation of the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, because identifying as an indigenous minority as opposed to religious minority is politically useful to attaining rights of being indigenous, such as the right to land, the right to self-govern, to preserve our language and our culture through social and state institutions. That way, Iraq cannot simply just, keep committing these acts of atrocities against us. Lastly, the burden of being Assyrian is heavy. However, the burden should not fall solely on the victim to advocate for recognition of these atrocities. We see the lack of blatant disrespect of memorial sites such as Semele, where the graves remain scattered and the site treated as a waste yard, with relatives being unable to provide their families proper burials. The international community, Turkey and Iraq, along with other states Assyrians traditionally live on, have the obligation to stop denying and deliberately covering up these genocidal campaigns in order to allow Assyrians the ability to heal and reconcile with what has happened. We should find ways in our community to help us with this reconciliation by setting aside the time to partake in storytelling and truth-telling, no matter how painful these stories may be. I know for myself it is always difficult to hear these stories, but even more so for the person relaying the story. So be patient and listen. Ask your parents and grandparents about their journey to wherever they are, their life. If we don't, these stories disappear with them. These stories help solidify our ancestral and contemporary connections to Mesopotamia. Iraq and Turkey offer a very different version of history than that we have. It appropriates our history and erases the legacies of genocide and assimilation policies aimed at eradicating us. However, we must work to restore our narrative by challenging and questioning this history. These states are able to hide these atrocities and look more innocent every time someone passes without telling these stories. These stories are our resistance and tell our account of history. In doing all these things, we need to empower our youth, the leaders of tomorrow. Our youth need to become aware of what happened to their ancestors and how it continues to shape their identities so that they can become active citizens advocating for justice and change for a better future. Collectively, youth from the diaspora need to make linkages to their ancestral land and work alongside Assyrians back home to restore indigenous justice, to showcase their resilience, and that we are survivors fighting for recognition of these atrocities so that we can move toward reconciliation and healing. So I really hope that after you leave here today, you do really ask for those stories, because it is painful to hear. I can't say it's not, but those stories are our history. So the more we document them, the more stories we have and the stronger it makes us. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Riva. That was an outstanding presentation. Our next speaker is Kathy Sayad Zatari. She is an Assyrian American attorney who practiced law for more than 35 years. She handled complex civil litigation and represented large corporate clients and public entities. Kathy was lead counsel in both bench and jury trials, and lead counsel arguing appeals before the Arizona Court of Appeals and the Arizona Supreme Court. Kathy was also an invited speaker by the Arizona, New Mexico, and Hawaii Bar Association at numerous seminars on a wide range of legal ethics topics. Now retired, Kathy devotes her time to serving as a consultant for the Assyrian community. Kathy has undertaken a number of advocacy projects on behalf of the Assyrian people, including speaking at a number of legal seminars on behalf of the Assyrians as indigenous people, as Congress members, advocating for Assyrian people before the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and assisting Refugees International with efforts to meet displaced Assyrian families in northern Iraq since the advent of ISIS. Kathy received her BA in History from Arizona State University in 1976 and her JD from the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University in 1979. She is a member of the Arizona and California Bar Association. I am proud to introduce Kathy Sayad Zatari.
Elie Wiesel said on genocide, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the oppressed. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." I come here today to talk about three main themes of the legacy of genocide. And this quote speaks to all three themes. These themes are remembering the past, understanding the present, and shaping the future. I want to talk a little bit about the definition of genocide. It was not even a legal term until after World War II, when in 1948, the United Nations codified the definition as this. Genocide is defined as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within that group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Clearly, this definition applies not only to the genocide of the Assyrians from 1915, but to 1933 and Simele, and to the continuing genocide in this century as I deliver these remarks this evening. The Assyrian community must transmit the knowledge not only of the past genocides, but of the ones that are ongoing. And the Assyrian community, as survivors, must do the three things that I said: remember the past, understand the present, and shape the future. But let's step back a minute and ask ourselves, why should we remember, especially events that happened over 100 years ago? Because Elie Wiesel also told us, without memory, there is no culture. Without memory, there would be no civilization, no society, no future. Many other peoples have suffered genocide as the Assyrian peoples have, but those peoples who are most successful have remembrance as a central theme in their lives, in their homes, and in their communities. We Assyrians must remember for two reasons. First, we must honor the sacrifices of our families and ancestors. They did not simply die of illness or old age. They did not die from natural disasters. They did not die taking part in war. They died for only one reason, because their more powerful neighbors denied their humanity and wanted to exterminate them. The second reason why we must remember: we must continue to make a record in each generation of the genocide our people have suffered and continue to suffer today. But why is making this record so important? The writer Michael Stark explained this very well when he said, "If no one remembers a misdeed or names it publicly, it remains invisible. To the outside observer, its victim is not a victim, and its perpetrator is not a perpetrator. Both are misperceived because the suffering of the one and the violence of the other go unseen. A double injustice occurs. The first when the original deed is done, and the second when it disappears." So what must we do with this record? Of course, we must continue to educate ourselves and our children. We must continue also, though more importantly, to educate those outside the Assyrian community. This is crucial in the diaspora if we are going to survive as a nation. Why is this so important? Because, as Michael Stark said, if an evil is not known, it did not happen. And further, when our neighbors and allies do have this record, they may not later say that they did not know of the genocide that happened. They may not later say that they had no idea this was happening at the present time. And this leads me back to Elie Wiesel's claim that we must take sides. There can be no neutrality for those who have knowledge of atrocities committed outside of their communities. And so this brings me to my grandmother, Shakar. Let me take a minute and introduce you to her a bit. She was a young Assyrian woman born late in the 19th century who lived in Ada, one of the dozens of Assyrian villages in the Urmi region in northwest Iran. Her father was a Christian minister. She had married young, as was the custom, and had 2 children. And then 1915 came. As the documents you've seen outside show, before then, her family owned a home and properties in Ada. Her husband was careful to correctly document the family's home and properties. But the young family's life would be destroyed in just 1 year. The Turks killed her husband in 1916, and then her 2 young children were killed the following year. By 1918, Shakar was all alone. She fled Urmi on foot, as did tens of thousands of other Assyrians, to the relative safety of a British camp in Baquba, Iraq. Within 1 year, she was one of the lucky few whom the Presbyterian Church in this country sponsored to emigrate to the United States. Most Assyrians in that camp were nearly as fortunate as she was. But this was at a time when Christians in this country were much more welcoming than they are now, and my grandmother would always be grateful for their aid. Shakar settled in Chicago, married another Assyrian man. They had 3 sons, the youngest of whom was my father. And somehow, she managed to keep those original property deeds with her from the exodus from Urmi to Baquba to this country. And I can't tell you how much having these original documents means to me and my family. It is documentation of her resilience, her will to survive, and the legacy she has passed on to my family. And I know many of you out here who have come this evening have similar stories. You must record them, document everything you know, save your family's heirlooms. This is remembrance. I turn to my second theme this evening, understanding the present. And by this I mean the need for the Assyrian community, and especially the Assyrian diaspora, to have a clear understanding of where our people are at this point in time. More than 90% of our people now reside outside the Middle East. We are now a diaspora people, and we will be for the foreseeable future. This is the understanding that all Assyrians, regardless of country of birth, must understand. There is little likelihood that any of us alive today will live to see a thriving Assyrian population again of millions in the Middle East. The future of the Assyrian people is now in the West. Many of us have settled in Western countries, and it is this segment of the diaspora that now holds the most political influence. The diaspora community must better understand the cultures and societies in the nations that have given us refuge. We will not increase our understanding by remaining isolated within our own communities. We must reach out to others from all ethnic backgrounds, all religious backgrounds, to truly understand the circumstances in which we are living. And this understanding includes learning about the suffering of other peoples. In the US today, we have Hispanic infants and children in cages, ordered there by our Justice Department. I'm 63 years old. I was born in this country. I was raised in this country. And I have never, ever seen the degree of hatred and viciousness I now see in this country, directed toward a number of different minority groups. We in the Assyrian diaspora have a responsibility to learn of the plight of other peoples, because we have a unique perspective in which to understand their suffering is our suffering. Thank you. As some of you know, I have mixed ancestry. My father was Assyrian, and my mother is of Irish descent, only in America. Growing up with this background, though, was one of the best educations a person could have had. I could not simply retreat back to my tribe. I didn't have a tribe. So I had to learn about people whose backgrounds were very different from my own. I quickly learned to judge people as individuals. I developed finely tuned antennae for when people were saying one thing to me and believing something quite different. And as a light-skinned person, I've learned how many whites in this country actually view minorities. Now let me preface these remarks with this. The majority of whites in this country are decent people, are good people, are caring people. But I cannot let go of this theme unaddressed in the current times that we live in, because this affects all of us. Many of these people will say very racist things about darker-skinned people to me, thinking I am one of them. And sadly, this has increased since November 2016. But from this, I learned who could be trusted and who could not be trusted, an ability that this Assyrian community very much needs now. So that's understanding the present. This is the second theme, but it's crucial to the third and final theme that I present this evening, shaping the future. Because the Assyrian diaspora must understand the social, legal, and political situations in their adopted countries to become effective advocates. So what must the Assyrian community do to help shape that future? The Assyrian community must understand that this is a long game. The Assyrian diaspora can survive, but it will take generations of hard work, transmitting language, transmitting history, transmitting culture. Notice I did not say transmitting DNA. The Assyrian community must be more accepting of others who join our families. My daughter is 1/4 Assyrian, and she is one of the most effective young Assyrian American advocates that I know. And if you'll let me have a brief aside, as a proud mom, she is getting a PhD in history from Harvard in May, and I can assure you she will take those credentials in helping our people. It is all about history and culture, and nothing about genetics. As we think about shaping the future, we must first acknowledge our own leadership's mistakes, and then correct them. The most troubling actions from the Assyrian community in the US that I've seen and experienced come from the Assyrian political leadership here. So to shape the future, what must our leadership do to become more effective? 3 things. First, remove the sexism. It is rampant in Assyrian advocacy organizations here, run by Assyrians who were born and raised in the Middle East. The vast majority of Assyrian American men who were born in this country have always treated me with respect and courtesy. Regrettably, I cannot say the same for those born in the Middle East. There are many extremely qualified women of Assyrian heritage, such as these wonderful young women you have seen tonight, who have either been shut out of the political leadership or worse, had their own advocacy efforts undermined by these men. This needs to stop now. Second, we need to understand the political culture in which we live. Assyrian advocacy groups in this country ought to be run by Assyrian Americans in this country who have either grown up here, were born here, or were raised in the West. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. I've been at countless meetings with State Department officials and congressional representatives and have witnessed firsthand the terrible presentations made by the current Assyrian political leadership, whose Middle Eastern culture, regrettably, is a huge stumbling block to the successful promotion of our communities. What's the third item? Have realistic goals, but have goals. And photo ops are not goals. The Assyrian diaspora must be more effective in identifying both long and short-term goals that will advance the welfare of our people. The Assyrian American political leadership is long on banquets, speeches, and meetings, and short on accomplishing objectives. Identifying all these goals is, of course, beyond the scope of my remarks this evening, but they should at least include these: helping ensure the safety of Assyrians still living in the Middle East, to promote the resettlement and integration of Assyrian immigrant families, and I can't stress this third one enough, making higher education a priority, the first priority for your children in this country. When our people are represented in this country by top engineers, doctors, lawyers, educators, scientists, writers, and artists, we will have clout, and we have a long way to go. Let me turn to 2 areas I've had experience with in my advocacy work. First, it is the recognition of the Assyrian people as an indigenous people, and the second, the possible creation of a safe haven for those Assyrians remaining in the Middle East. The former will be much easier to accomplish than the latter. When I use the term indigenous peoples, this is a legal term of art. I'm referring to the definition coined by the United Nations Economic and Social Council, which regularly holds programs for indigenous peoples throughout the world. This definition, by the way, was not even created until the 1980s. We did not have a legal definition of indigenacy until then. But this is the definition. Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those that, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion or pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing in those territories. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems. If this definition does not include the Assyrians, I don't know what would. The importance of international recognition of the Assyrians as an indigenous people under this legal definition is that there are a number of United Nations declarations and conventions that provide any indigenous peoples certain rights and recognition. For those Assyrians who will continue to live in the Middle East, this is crucial. The Assyrian American leadership must make better efforts to advocate for these peoples in the Middle East. The second, longer-term goal may be the establishment of a safe haven for Assyrians remaining in the Middle East, primarily Iraq. There has been much talk about establishing an autonomous region, the Nineveh Plain, as a safe haven for the Assyrian communities there. I was involved in talks with congressional representatives and State Department officials about this very subject prior to the invasion by ISIS. Time doesn't permit me to discuss every requirement needed for an establishment of such a region, but let me tell you this. The legal obstacles are few. What is the real obstacle is the lack of political will in the West to help create this. However, there are, if we look far enough into the future, a number of nations within nations models throughout the world in which an Assyrian autonomous region might model itself after. The one that I have the most experience with is the model of tribal lands in the United States, and one that I believe could serve as an exemplar. By saying this, please understand this. Again, I live in Arizona. I've lived there 45 years. I'm privileged to know many tribal peoples. I do not denigrate the centuries of mistreatment they have faced on this land that they were here first. And the establishment of reservations was far from a benign act by the US government. And in fact, most of the peoples on these reservations now are living in lands that were not their ancestral homeland. But they have figured out they are better keeping their autonomy through these lands, and that's the course they have taken. Nearly 1/3 of Arizona is reservation land and home to some 28 tribes. Each reservation has its own police, its own legal system, and its own courts. In Phoenix, I live 10 miles from the Salt River Pima reservation, and I am not permitted to practice law in their court, as I am not an admitted member. Tribal entities are largely autonomous. So if there ever is the political will in the West to support an autonomous region, I believe we should revisit this model. So again, let me talk about the themes I've covered. Remembrance of the past, honoring those who have suffered, understanding the present, awareness of the circumstances we find ourselves in, and shaping the future, the job that we must undertake now. In closing, I say we have a long way to go before we may say never again. As a very wise man named Barack Obama said, never again is a challenge to defend the fundamental right of free people and free nations to exist in peace and security. The Assyrian diaspora has a huge responsibility to protect our cultural heritage and identity, and I will do whatever I can to further this cause. I want to thank Ms. Carmen Morad and Cal State University Stanislaus for inviting me this evening and giving me this opportunity to share my views. And I thank all of you for coming and attending this wonderful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Shaker would be proud. By the way, my heritage is also from Ada, from where my father was born, so we share the same heritage. So our last speaker is Dr. Adrina Alkhas. She is the Marketing and Communications Director for the Stanislaus County Fair and an adjunct professor at Modesto Junior College and a lecturer at Stanislaus State Communications Department. She graduated with a master's in communication from University of the Pacific in 2004, received her doctorate in educational leadership from CSU Stanislaus in 2011. Adrina's marketing strategies and tactics for the fair have received several recognitions, the most recent being named Publicist of the Year by PR News. Other awards include honorable mention for Best Event Marketer for PR News, first place award through Western Fair Association, the WFA, for Best Social Media Campaign, as well as the second place award for other social media categories. In 2017, Adrina was the recipient of the Modesto Bee's 20 Under 40 Award. She created an award-winning Empower Lounge at her local fair, which is geared towards inspiring young girls to be great leaders in our community. giving girls the confidence to be themselves through workshops and giving them the skills needed to empower others as much as empowering themselves. Adrina is married and has 3 children, and I am proud to have worked with Adrina. And as you saw in the lobby, she has written a book. She's a published author, and she will tell you a story and a chapter from that book. So please help me welcome Dr. Adrina Al-Husn.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you for Stan State for having me here. Bear with me. Let me just pull up my handy PowerPoint. Women back then and the resilience that they had to go through. And the superhero aspect I talk about, because I needed this to resonate not just with my Assyrian brothers and sisters, but with everybody. I talk about a superhero, and a superhero phase, provisional phase, where they go through a specific situation that refines their strength, and an event that helps define who they will become. Will they become a villain or remain true to their heart as someone who saves lives? In any leadership role, you must remember to try to emulate what a woman's superhero stands for. So I talk about leadership skills in my book and how women leaders must use these characteristic traits in any type of leadership that they do. So in order to understand my great-grandmother's story, you must understand, like Riva did a beautiful job. I'm so proud of you. That was beautiful. You must understand the background of the Assyrian genocide before understanding my great-grandmother's heroic story. The Assyrian genocide needs to be recognized worldwide, which is why we're here today talking. But the story of the genocide and those who lived through it must be told before that can happen. And you know, my grandmother, they didn't have a voice. We are their voice. Those of us that are educated in this country, we were born here, educated, we are their voice. So that's why we're here doing this. And thank God Carmen put all this together. And there's so many others doing this. It's not just us on this stage, but there's so many of us that are doing this because we need it to be recognized for our people who didn't have a voice, for our people now who don't have a voice in Iraq, in Syria, in the Middle East. They don't. It's up to us. So my grandmother would tell us she talked to me in detail about the refugee camps. So the women formed a system, which is how I came up with Empower Her, and women building, they formed together to make a better situation for themselves. The British government took care of them and provided a multitude of clothing, rice, tea, and other foods. And the women in the camp would take these products and make the best of everything provided, and they cooked bread in tanura, or the wood fire clay oven, to provide for the rest. The women worked together in this hardship and created a cohesive system to provide food, mend clothes, provide the children with education, and so much more. It is the women who made sure to preserve all the extra food in case they had to be in the camps longer than expected. And my great-grandmother, as she passed on her story, she would say, the men didn't know how to do any of this. It was us, the women, who took care of all that. And after 6 months in the refugee camp, my great-grandparents left for Habania, Iraq. So when I talk about the battlefield, I try to compare women working in corporate world, climbing the ladder, or anybody, it's men too. Do we find ourselves in the battlefield to make it to the top no matter the cost? Survival of the fittest. Is that true? Do we change our ethics and who we are for the sake of climbing that ladder or to survive that battle? Is the workplace in America a battlefield for women versus women? And how do we overcome this to mentor younger women coming into the workforce? In order to survive, women must support each other and learn to mentor younger women below them without feeling that they are competition. How did my great-grandmother and all those women in the refugee camps survive, and their children? They worked together. And that's what we have to do. You know, we have to support each other and make sure there's room for everybody. So, you know, in my book, I do talk about growing up Assyrian, and my parents are here. We were grown up in a strict household, as maybe some of us were. You know, when we'd go to convention or if it was at Civic Club, my dad would say, "La saqitun al bar." That means don't go up to the bar. Which a few months ago we were at a wedding, and my daughter wanted to go hang out with her aunts at the bar at Civic, and I said, "La saqat al bar." So my parents' words rang true, and it was like seeping out from my mouth as I was telling my daughter, and I thought, wow, I'm my parents now, which is good, because they raised us right. And you know, I'm sorry, I know you said you had trouble with Middle Eastern men, but my father's from Iraq, my husband's from Iran, and I mean, he raised us to be ourselves and to go to college and to be who we are. And my husband has always supported me and everything. My mother is here, who is her grandmother that I talk about. And, you know, it was hard. Like, yeah, we couldn't go to prom, or, Mom, can I go to the movies? No. Why are you going? Who are you going with? What time are you going to be home? And, you know, all the 50 questions before we can actually, okay, then I won't even ask. So, but I appreciated my parents and how they raised us, because I'm trying to do that with my children now, you know. And, but in what we are talking about with the genocide, with the Assyrian footprints, the battlefield that my great-grandparents went through, and my great-grandfather, and the men also that survived this Assyrian genocide, they also have to be recognized. I know I talk a lot about women and empowerment, but it is also the men, because I have brothers, I have a father, I have 2 sons that are sitting here. One's asleep, but I'm trying to raise them to also be educated and to give back to the Assyrian community. So with the Assyrian footprints, the battlefield, they can kill us and torture us. They want us extinct. Our monuments and literature can be burned. Burn our homes and our churches. Give us ultimatums to either convert or die. But Assyria will always live until the end of time, because God is with us. And I have 2 verses from Isaiah and Matthew. Isaiah, Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Matthew chapter 12, the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with the generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. I want to thank you. Thank you for your patience and listening. And I want to thank Carmen and Stan State. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrina. I'd like to ask Ms. Sweeney Bitsergis to come up and in closing for her final performance, and then we'll have our recognitions. Thank you.